All right, in this lesson, we'll dive into the gets method and the chomp method. The gets method collects input from the user. So far, we've had programs that are basically very static. We simply output text to the screen, perform calculations and such. We've never actually accepted user input. In this lesson, we'll dive into that. So we'll begin by exploring this concept in IRB. We'll then transition to the Atom text editor, where we'll write a file that asks the user to input both their name and their age, and then we'll run that Ruby file from the terminal. So we're going to switch around between a few different screens here. Let's begin with IRB. Again, I'm on a Mac, and if you're on a Mac in the terminal, you can simply type IRB. If you're on Windows, you can find the interactive Ruby program within the directory where Ruby is installed and run it, and then follow along with the commands. So let's begin with gets. Gets is short for getString, and predictably, it gets a string from the user. It collects input. Now, no matter what the user types when we use gets, it's always going to be a string is going to be the final return value. So if we ask the user for their age and they type in 25, that 25 is still going to be given to us as a string. That's why it's called the gets method, the getString method. So I'm just going to write gets without anything else, and when I execute this, it'll feel like the IRB is, in some kind of pause or in some kind of error. But what it's actually doing here is awaiting for you to give it the input. We haven't specifically told the user what we want to expect. We simply just asked for gets, and now IRB is waiting for us to input something. So I'm just going to type in my name. It doesn't have to be my name, but I'm just going to type in a random bunch of characters, Boris. And you can see that it's going to give me Boris. So it's basically taking that input. Now, we haven't done anything with that input. We haven't manipulated it. We haven't pointed a variable to it. So it's basically now lost. It's gone from memory. But we can see that it's able to take the input that I typed in, which was my name, and give it back to us as the final return value. Now, we're going to run into an issue here, and you can see here that the default output here is going to include that /n. Now, we saw this in an earlier lesson, and what that indicates is a line break. By default, whenever you are entering something as a user, when, for example, I use the gets method, whenever I type Boris and then I execute with the enter key, Ruby is going to interpret that enter key as a line break, and even though it's going to terminate at that point, it's also going to keep that line break. So whenever we use gets, by default, it's always going to include that line break at the end, which could cause problems. Let me give you one example. Let's say what I'm now going to do is I'm going to create a variable called name, and I'm going to set it equal to gets. Now remember, what happens on the right side of the equal sign always takes place first. So when I execute this, Ruby is once again going to expect an input because I used gets. Now when I type this, for example, Boris, it's going to take that input, it's going to use it as a string, and then it's going to take name and point it to that string of Boris, which I just typed. So now if I output name, we can see that name, the variable, is properly pointing to the string that the user entered. In this case, the user is myself, but if I were a programmer and I were writing this for somebody else to use, you could allow them to input something into your program this way, and now you have access to it among your variables. Now the problem with this line break is it can create some kind of formatting issues. For example, if I want to output puts, thank you for giving me your name, and then I'm going to use string interpolation here with the hashtag and the curly braces to put in my variable, which is name. Thank you for giving me your name, blank. See you later. I'm going to close my double quotes here. What you're going to see here is it's going to say, thank you for giving me your name, Boris. And then the line break that comes in by default from the gets method right here is going to create a line break, and all of a sudden this sentence now appears weird because we've pushed everything to the next line. So we need a convenient way to remove that line break from the end of whatever input gets accepts, and we do that with the chomp method. The chomp method is called directly on a string, and all that it basically does is remove the new line character at the end of a string. So for example, just to give you this example before we assign it to a variable, if I type out gets.chomp, remember that it's going to be executed in order, so this is valid code. This is actually called method chaining because Ruby is first going to run gets. It's then going to get the input from me, the user, which is going to be a string, and then it's going to call the chomp method on that string object. So method chaining is basically a process by which we call different things on top of each other or after each other. And the reason we can do that is because everything that Ruby gives us back is always some kind of object. So when I call gets by itself, whatever the user types in is going to be a string object, and a string object will include methods such as length, which we've explored previously, such as upcase, such as downcase, and strings will also include this new method called chomp, which removes the new line at the end. So this is perfectly valid syntax. Now when I execute this, Ruby is going to await my input. I'm going to type in Boris. And we can see, comparing this example right here with this example at the very top, when we use just gets, we have that new line character at the end. When we use gets.chomp, that string has the chomp method called on it, and we've successfully removed the new line character. So now we have the name as we want it. So what we can do now is rerun my name equals gets command, but this time I want to add chomp. So that will automatically take the user input, which will be their name. It will remove the new line character, and now name will properly store that string without that line break. So if I do name equals gets.chomp, now I'm going to type in Boris. If I output name, we can see that it does in fact include Boris without the line break. And now if I use interpolation to write the same thing, I'm going to make it shorter. Thank you, name, see you later. We can see that it's going to say, thank you, Boris, see you later. It's successfully interpolated the value of that name variable within it, but it hasn't added that line break, and this looks a lot more presentable. Keep in mind that because this is a put statement, the final return value of the put statement, as we explored a few lessons ago, is still nil. It's still going to output this because that's what puts does, but the actual return value of puts is still nil. That's why we see this rocket symbol with nil right here. So at this point, I'm just going to press exit or type in exit to leave IRB. And now I'm going to transition to the Atom text editor, where we're going to make a full program that asks the user for two inputs, their name and age. All right, so now I'm back in my Atom text editor, and I'm going to write a simple program that asks the user for their name and age. I'm not going to include the Atom runner output here because it actually doesn't work with input using gets, so we'll have to run this Ruby file from our terminal or our command prompt, depending on what operating system you're watching this on. So what I would recommend is just creating a new .rb file. In this case, I've called it the gets method, and keep in mind, just always keep that best practice of using underscores between any subsequent words in your file name. Spaces are a big no-no among programmers, especially when it comes to naming files. So I've just created a simple file called the gets method. You can call yours whatever you'd like, sample or test, as long as it has that .rb extension at the end, and as long as you know where it's located and can navigate to it in your terminal or command prompt, you should be fine. So the first thing I want to ask the user is their name. Now, in the previous example where we did this in IRB, we simply did gets.chomp, but we didn't tell the user exactly what we wanted. So we first need to begin with some kind of notice to the user, asking them and clarifying for them what it is that they're expected to input. So I'm going to begin with a put statement that just says, hi, what's your name? At this point, this is just going to be a simple output in the terminal. And now what I want to do is do gets.chomp. Again, that's going to take their user input and then remove the new line from the end of the string. But again, if I just do gets.chomp, Ruby will prompt the user for an input and it will pause the program, but we're not going to save it anywhere until we use a variable and point to the result. So I'm going to store this result in a variable called name. I'm then going to put great, what's your age? Now keep in mind, when Ruby executes, everything is executed sequentially from top to bottom. So at this point in the program, whenever we call gets.chomp, Ruby is going to pause while it waits for the user to get the input or put in the input. So this line of great, what's your age is not actually going to be output until Ruby can get to it, and Ruby will only get to it when the user submits with the enter key. So we don't have to worry about the fact that this is later. It's not going to appear until the user completes the name for us. So we're going to do the same thing as we did above, where we're going to do a variable called age, and we're going to do gets.chomp. Now, here's where we're going to run into an interesting issue. Now, technically speaking, with string interpolation, as I've mentioned, you can interpolate different variables of different data types within a string, no problem. Whenever you use the gets method, it is automatically giving us back a string. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but for the purposes of maintaining data integrity, since age is ideally supposed to be a number, what I want to do here is convert the string that I'm guaranteed to get from the gets method to a integer. Now we do that in Ruby with a method called to_I. So you may recall a few lessons ago that we used the toS method on an integer to convert an integer to a string, and this is the exact opposite. It takes a string object, and a string object has a toI method, and what the toI method does is convert that string to an integer if it can. Now again, you might be thinking, why, if we're just going to interpolate this in some kind of statement to the user, do we want to convert age to an integer? Well, what happens if your program has to do some kind of calculation? What if you need to add? What if you need to tell the user what their age is going to be like in 25 years? You can't add 25 to a string. So it's probably best to keep your data types in the most versatile data type for calculations revolving them, and then simply use string interpolation to bring them back. So that's why I've converted this to an integer. That's just the best practice, even if in this example, in this specific program, we're not actually going to be doing any mathematical calculations. Now that we've received both of the user's two inputs in two separate variables, name and age, let's just output it back to the user with the put statement and some string interpolation. So I'm going to write puts, cool. So your name is, and we're going to use the hashtag curly braces to interpolate, and I'm going to put my name variable in here. And again, this time I have no clue what name is going to be. It can be whatever the user types in. It can be my name, Boris. If the user's name Jack, they can type in Jack. They can type in whatever random characters it can be. I don't even know what the user is going to input, but whatever it is, it's going to be stored in the name variable, and I'm just going to inject my name variable in here to print it out. So now if I do cool, so your name is name, and you are, I'm going to now use string interpolation again, and I can use this even though age at this point is a integer. And you are age years old. I'm going to save this, and that's it. That's our entire program. It's just going to accept two inputs and spit them back out to the user. So at this point, I'm going to transition to the terminal. All right, now I'm back in the terminal on a Mac, and as a reminder, some of these commands may be different on a Windows system. Just follow along with your respective commands that we introduced in the first module of this course to run a Ruby file. So I am storing my Ruby file with the gets method on my desktop. So I'm at my desktop. I'm going to write ls just to confirm that this file is here, the gets method.rb. Again, as I mentioned, your file does not have to have this name, and you don't have to place it on the desktop. Just navigate to whatever folder it is that you created the file in. And now I'm going to follow the familiar syntax of writing Ruby space followed by the name of the file I want to run. I'm going to type out the, and at this point I can actually just press tab, which will do tab completion, which is basically going to complete the file name for me, Ruby, and the terminal is going to look for any file names that match what I've currently typed. In this case, I only have one file on my desktop. It's this file, so it knows that that's the one I'm referring to. So now I'm going to execute. And here we go. It says, hi, what's your name? That was our first put statement. And notice that the program is now paused until I enter an input. So I'm going to say Boris. All right, I'm going to press enter. And it's going to say, great, what's your age? I'm going to enter 25. Now again, even though I as a user am entering this as 25, the gets method is accepting it as a string, remember that. Then the chomp method is cutting off the line break. And finally, we're still calling the toI method to convert it to an integer in case we want to do some kind of mathematical operations behind the scenes. Now, in the front end, the user who is running this program has no clue what we're doing. They're simply just executing these commands. Now, when I input my value again with enter, we're going to get cool. So your name is Boris and you are 25 years old. Notice that whatever values I typed in have been saved to those variables, and then those variables are interpolated into the resulting string. And watch, this could work with no matter what input I put in here. So if I press up to just get that command again and I run the file from the beginning, I can enter something different. Hi, what's your name? Let's do Jack. Great, so what's your age? 52. Cool, so your name is Jack and you are 52 years old. So you can see that the file is adaptable and it's able to use whatever input the user gets to modify the results. Now this is a very simple example. This is just a very easy introduction to how gets works. But you can see that it's helpful for accepting user input. We're now adding an element of interactivity to our program. Our Ruby program can now interact with a user. Even somebody who isn't familiar with Ruby per se can run this program and simply follow the commands, and we can do certain operations with whatever they pass in to give them whatever result they're looking for. So this is a quick introduction to the gets method and the chomp method, and it also concludes our very first getting started module. My goal here was really to give you a kind of broad overview of some of the complete basics of the Ruby programming language. In upcoming modules, we'll be diving into specific objects like numbers and booleans and strings. But for now, this is just to kind of get your foot in the door and get you kind of curious and interested about what it is that a programming language can do, and kind of introduce you to things like the general object structure of Ruby. So I hope you're having a good time, and I will see you in the very next module.